It's without question that the latter portion of the 1980s would feature professional wrestling as a globally accepted form of entertainment. With that, the year 1988 would see a year-round schedule of WWF pay-per-views supplemented by their broad selection of network specials. This calendar year would also see a timeless assortment of characters for the LJN-produced Wrestling Superstars toy line. This would actually be LJN's final year making this line of figures and was the second last year of seeing these figures in production altogether. But what a lineup it was, and we can have a closer look at this cast of characters right here and now. Let's begin. This video is brought to you by Serpentor's Lair, a pop culture entertainment and news website. Please visit serpentorslair.com for updates regarding toys, television, movies, and more. The link is in the description below. 1988 was a transition year that would see LJN's last year in making the Wrestling Superstars figures, seeing as the 1989 set would migrate over to the much smaller Canadian-based Grand Toys company. It is worth noting as a whole though that 1988 saw seismic shifts and changes in the boys-targeted action figure industry. The globally viral Transformers would see their final shortened cartoon season in the United States during 1987, focusing their animation efforts overseas with Japanese voice acting and Japanese episodes in 1988, along with the more gimmick-heavy toys that were still reasonably popular on store shelves. G.I. Joe Real American Hero would see an animated film in 1987, but would close up shop on this front until DiC launched the series again in 1989. Note though that the late 1980s would see more focus on G.I. Joe sub-teams rather than characters in their more well-known Sunbow and Marvel comic appearances. By comparison, Mattel's Masters of the Universe saw a bigger fiscal drop in 1987 compared to the other two aforementioned boys-targeted toy brands. They featured a live-action film in 1987 but needed a more wholesale change with the New Adventures of He-Man toy line that ran from 1989 through to the early 1990s. Of course, Turtle Power dominated the airwaves non-stop in 1988, shifting the global phenomenon amongst the young male demographic to 4 amphibious heroes along with their allies and villains, while the previous big three of the 1980s would play second fiddle. And yes, for live entertainment, the movie, television, and also music industries would give us some timeless classics during this period, but it's no doubt that wrestling was a big part of this entertainment boom. Of course, a lot of people would remember Hulk Hogan's controversial loss to Andre the Giant as part of the February 1988 episode of The Main Event. This episode remains famous to this day for the incredible 15.2 Nielsen TV rating that it drew, reported to be seen by 33 million households. The WWF pay-per-view schedule was also largely rounding into form by this time. The annual WrestleMania event featured a tournament for the vacated WWF Championship. We'd see the first ever SummerSlam with Hulk Hogan and the Macho Man Randy Savage teaming up to take on Andre the Giant and the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase. And we get the second annual Survivor Series in the fall of this year, which would continue the tradition of team-focused matches. And while not officially considered a pay-per-view yet, the first ever Royal Rumble broadcast to audiences kicked off the 1988 calendar year that January. This featured a 20-man over-the-top rope match won by Hacksaw Jim Duggan before the event switched to being a 30-participant elimination match in the years that would follow. The World Wrestling Federation would air this particular Royal Rumble special on the USA Network, opposite to the Jim Crockett Promotions Bunkhouse Stampede that was on pay-per-view that same night. Talk about the war for wrestling supremacy. Anyway, enough about the actual wrestling landscape in 1988, and let's talk about the actual LJN produced product in this year's lineup itself. Where else to begin but with the immortal Hulk Hogan. The red shirt and white shirt versions from this year have become a little more scarce and definitely highly desirable over the years. Notice that they are considerably bulkier in their stature compared to the lankier 1984 Series 1 release that came in his more signature colors, but to be honest, I prefer the more muscular look for this figure. Yes, 1988 would still be a year where Hogan was a big part of the World Wrestling Federation, but it was also when he took time off to film the cult classic No Holds Barred. That of course left the responsibility of world champion to the Macho Man Randy Savage. But either way you look at it, the fact that Hogan got 3 distinct figures in this 8-inch series of LJN Wrestling Superstars shows just how much of a leading frontman and icon Hogan was, and still is in the wrestling industry. The aforementioned Hacksaw Jim Duggan would also see a release this year, coinciding with the Royal Rumble victory that was a highlight of his career. This figure has grown more desirable over the years, much like others in this wave, being a later release, but also because of the easily lost 2x4 accessory that became synonymous with Jim Duggan over the decades. While never a fixture of the main event scene, Jim Duggan would always be a standout due to his lighthearted nature and because he would lead the USA chants in the ring as part of his American patriotism persona. This year of LJN Wrestling Superstars was also known as a year where some figures were not cast in the flesh color coming out of the factory, where normally the tights and other details would be painted on after the fact. Some figures in this year were actually cast in the same color as their wrestling gear or their entrance gear, with the flesh details painted on afterwards. This is why some of the figures look a little bit strange when the paint wears off, as can be seen in some of the images here. Amongst that, the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase was one of these figures, but as a character, he became a top heel by the late 1980s. In fact, he was awarded the WWF Championship the night Andre won the belt from Hogan and forfeited the belt to DiBiase, who, on screen, had purchased the belt from Andre. That being said, while images exist of him with the belt around his waist, this is not a recognized title reign in the WWE record books. DiBiase would go on to the finals of the WrestleMania 4 tournament in the spring of 1988, losing eventually to the Macho Man while having an incredible year all around, especially as he was also part of the main event of SummerSlam and Survivor Series that was mentioned earlier. Do note that the figure in this collection is quite worn and probably needs to be replaced at some point. Either way, the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase was well known for a lot of heelish tendencies during this golden era of pro wrestling. Thankfully though, the Bam Bam Bigelow figure in this collection is in far better condition than DiBiase, which is crucial for a figure like this that has a lot of painted details. Bam Bam did alternate between being both a heel as well as a face throughout his peak years. He was considerably agile for a big man, and while the mid-card scene was the usual placement on the card for Bam Bam, he was still pretty convincing when he was utilized as a main eventer from time to time. Another big man here, George Gray took on a few key personas throughout his wrestling career. Among them, there was the dancing big man known as Akeem, who would team with the Big Boss Man, but even before that, he was known as the One-Man Gang. Notably, the Akeem gimmick was a big departure from the one-man gang gimmick, at least cosmetically. The gang would often squash enhancement level talent, though he'd often find himself on the losing end when going up against the big name main event babyfaces. It's notable though that he was the last man eliminated during that inaugural televised Royal Rumble, which Hacksaw Jim Duggan won, as mentioned earlier. This year also saw the lineup entry of a wrestler many consider as the greatest Intercontinental Champion of all time, the Honky Tonk Man. A 450-plus day title reign that spanned from 1987 through to 1988, Honky Tonk would lose in quick fashion to the Ultimate Warrior in SummerSlam of that year to end his impressive run as Intercontinental Champ. Known for smashing his guitar over the heads of a ton of popular babyfaces, this Elvis lookalike is one of the first names you think of as far as wrestling is concerned, particularly during the late 1980s and early 1990s. He was quite versatile and could be used anywhere on the card, be it as a single star, a tag team star, and even as a manager later on in his career. The tag team scene also got some level of representation this year. In particular, the strike force of Rick Martel and Tito Santana were part of this wave. While you can still see Tito Santana as part of the previous LJN 1986 Series 3 set of releases, this one has him and Martel in their white trunks, signifying their tag team. They became the tag champs as of late 1987 as a babyface team and would lose the belts during the calendar year of 1988, before officially splitting up by WrestleMania 5 the following year in 1989, which is when Rick Martel decided to turn heel and leave his partner mid-match in the center of the ring. Soon after, Martel would go on to adopt his Rick the Model Martel gimmick, while Santana would still continue to have a respectable singles run as well. And speaking of tag teams, Demolition's Axe was part of this wave. If LJN's series had continued through to the 1990s, I do wonder if Smash would have been included as well to complete the team. Demolition had 3 tag team title reigns between 1988 and 1990, primarily held by Axe and Smash, but Crush was later added to the group during the team's 3rd title run. These Kiss Band lookalikes were definitely a staple of this era for pro wrestling. As for non-wrestling personalities, Johnny Valiant was added to this wave. He's often forgotten among the more popular managers of this era, but he did manage some names such as Dino Bravo, Brutus Beefcake, as well as Greg Valentine. And speaking of the other popular managers, the smooth-talking Slick was added to this year's lineup. With his signature top hat, Slick was amazing on the microphone, being amongst the charismatic, flamboyant managers of this era. He was often seen in the corner of significant tag teams like the Twin Towers, as well as Power and Glory, and the Uganda Giant, Kamala, among many others. Rounding out this year's lineup was the WWF referee. Smaller in stature than pretty much everyone except for Mean Gene Okerlund in the entire LJN Wrestling Superstars toy line, the referee was found in either a blue or white shirt in terms of its variants. The referee was just left unnamed on his packaging, leaving the referee's identity to the imagination of young minds at the time of its release. Throughout this Wrestling Superstars series, you'll notice I haven't talked about the smaller, rubberized bendies figures that were released during this period, nor the thumb wrestler rubber figures. That's simply because the primary focus of LJN's wrestling lineup during this time clearly centered on their 8-inch series, and the smaller figures consisted of largely the same lineup of superstars anyway. Surely, there was a lot to love about wrestling in 1988, and as popular as it was, it's exciting to think about the fact that wrestling would continue to reach new heights after this period of time. Either way, it was a time when wrestling felt more cartoonish than the more reality-based eras that would come after this, and that innocent nature represents the true, perpetual charm associated with this time period. And if you enjoyed this video, don't go anywhere just yet. You can click on other wrestling related videos, including the rest of the LJN WWF Superstars wrestling video series right over here. Subscribe if you already haven't, press that like button to spread this video to more viewers, and share it with your friends. And with that, I'll see you all next time. Take care.